Hey guys, tonight we're doing one of those stories that feels energetic on paper, but somehow becomes very soothing once you stretch it out, lower your voice, and remove all urgency from it. So go ahead and dim the lights. Let your phone rest somewhere nearby. Unclench your jaw. Tonight, we're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, that Napoleon. The one everyone remembers as angry, ambitious, brilliant, and allegedly about the height of a kitchen stool. Which is interesting because he wasn't. But history, as it turns out, is not especially concerned with being fair. It's more concerned with being petty. And Napoleon gave the world a lot to be petty about. So tonight, we're not rushing through battles or shouting about empires. We're just going to gently drift through the life of a man who conquered most of Europe, rewrote governments, traumatized monarchies, and then got permanently clowned by cartoonists for being short. A reputation that stuck so hard it became a psychological term, which is impressive in a deeply unnecessary way. So let's ease into it. No sudden drama, no heroic music. Just a slow walk through propaganda, measuring systems, bruised egos, and one extremely average-sized man who could not escape the slander. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. Corsica had just recently been taken over by France, which meant Napoleon entered the world already surrounded by resentment, political tension, and people arguing about who actually belonged there. A calming environment, really. His family was minor nobility, which is a polite way of saying they had a fancy last name, not much money, and very strong opinions about their own importance. Napoleon himself was not immediately charming. As a child, he was described as intense, withdrawn, and deeply unpleasant to be around. He spoke French with a Corsican accent that made other kids mock him relentlessly. He was not tall, not handsome, and not especially likable. But he was very good at holding grudges, which, historically speaking, is a growth industry. When he was sent to military school in mainland France, things did not improve socially. He was poor compared to the other students, he dressed badly, he ate too fast, he spoke strangely, and instead of adapting, he leaned into it, hard. He read obsessively, he isolated himself, he developed a personality best described as future dictator in the making. This is important because the short Napoleon myth doesn't come from physical measurements at first, it comes from vibes. Napoleon had short guy energy long before anyone pulled out a ruler. He was moody, defensive, easily offended, constantly convinced people were disrespecting him, which, to be fair, they were, but still. Now, let's deal with the height thing early so we can all relax. Napoleon's recorded height at death was about 5'6" or 5'7" by modern measurements. That was average for a Frenchman in the early 19th century, possibly even slightly above average. He was not towering, but he was also not a goblin lurking below the furniture. So where did this idea come from? Several places, because of course it did. First, there was the confusion between French inches and British inches. French inches were longer, so when British observers converted his height using their own system, they shaved off a couple of inches. And then they acted very proud of themselves. Second, Napoleon was often surrounded by very tall imperial guards. This was intentional. He liked them tall, he liked them imposing, he liked standing next to men who looked like oak trees in hats. It made him seem more commanding, or so he thought. Unfortunately, it also made him look like someone's irritated manager. Third, and most important, the British absolutely hated him. And when the British hate you, they don't just fight you, they brand you. British cartoonists went to work with the enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Napoleon was drawn tiny, petulant, stomping around Europe like an angry child knocking over toy kingdoms. He was called Little Boney,
He was mocked relentlessly. His ego was exaggerated. His temper was turned into a punchline. His body was shrunk for maximum disrespect. And once that image sticks, it sticks forever. Napoleon, meanwhile, was busy being too successful to notice at first. By his mid-20s, he had risen through the ranks of the French military at an absurd pace. France was in the middle of a revolution. Everyone was being executed. Governments were collapsing weekly. It was chaos. And Napoleon thrived in chaos like a man who emotionally prepared for nothing else. He won battles through logistics, speed, and sheer audacity. He marched armies across Europe with frightening efficiency. He humiliated old monarchies run by men who still believed divine right would save them from artillery. It did not. And this is where the irony starts to gently hum in the background. Napoleon was not obsessed with his height in his early career. He was obsessed with competence, with order, with control, with being taken seriously. The short jokes came later, after the cartoons, after the exile, after the world had time to flatten him into a caricature. In real life, Napoleon was more worried about being disrespected intellectually. He despised incompetence. He hated disloyalty. He had no patience for fools, which was unfortunate because his court eventually filled with them. He crowned himself emperor in 1804, literally crowned himself. The Pope was there ready to do it, and Napoleon just took the crown and put it on his own head. Because, of course he did. Subtlety was not part of the brand. This moment alone guaranteed that Europe would never stop mocking him. You cannot grab a crown out of the Pope's hands and then expect the press to be kind. As emperor, Napoleon redesigned France. Laws, bureaucracy, education. He centralized everything.
He codified laws that are still influential today. He also installed his siblings on foreign thrones like it was a family group project no one asked for. And this is where things start to go slightly wrong. Slowly, calmly, with paperwork. Napoleon trusted himself completely. He trusted his family not at all, and yet he kept giving them power. His brothers were incompetent, his sisters were dramatic, his marshals were brilliant but exhausted, and Europe was getting tired of him rearranging their governments like furniture. All the while, British propaganda kept working. Every defeat Napoleon suffered was exaggerated. Every retreat was turned into a tantrum. Every decision was framed as emotional instability. The short, angry dictator narrative grew stronger, even as his actual physical presence remained unremarkable. Napoleon himself began to internalize some of this hostility. He grew more paranoid, more controlling, less willing to compromise. He doubled down on authority, because why not double down? He divorced his first wife, Josephine, not because he didn't love her, but because she couldn't give him an heir, which is a deeply romantic sentence in royal history terms. He then married a teenage Austrian archduchess to secure legitimacy. She was young, he was not. They had one son. Napoleon immediately projected all his ambitions onto the child. This did not end well, emotionally or politically. Then came Russia. We're not doing battle scenes tonight. No marching, no snow drama, just the quiet understanding that invading Russia is historically a bad idea, and Napoleon did it anyway, because he believed his own legend. And legends, once believed, tend to collapse slowly and publicly. After that, things unraveled. Defeat, exile, a brief comeback, another defeat, another exile, this time to a very remote island, St. Helena. Far away, windy, damp, boring. The kind of place where history sends you to think about your life choices. And here's the soft, sleepy twist. During his exile, Napoleon was measured, carefully, by doctors, by attendants. His height was recorded, and it confirmed what had always been true. He was not short, he was not towering, he was just a man.
But it didn't matter. By then, the myth had outgrown him. Napoleon complex entered the language. Short men were now associated with overcompensation, aggression, ambition. One man's political enemies had reshaped an entire psychological stereotype. That's efficiency. Napoleon died in 2021, possibly of stomach cancer, possibly of arsenic poisoning, possibly just from the long-term effects of stress, exile, and being constantly furious at the ocean. Even in death, people argued about him, which he would have hated and loved. The cartoons lived on. The jokes survived. The image of the tiny tyrant stomping through Europe became permanent. And the real Napoleon, average height, extraordinary ambition, exhausting personality, faded behind the punchline. So when you hear that Napoleon was short, what you're really hearing is propaganda that worked too well. A reminder that history is not just written by the victors, sometimes it's doodled by people with printing presses and grudges. And as we gently drift forward, we'll see that Napoleon was far from the only ruler whose body, mind, or bloodline became a public spectacle. Royals are very good at being turned into symbols, especially unflattering ones. So take a slow breath, let that thought settle, and when you're ready, we can continue floating forward into the even stranger ways history reshaped real people into convenient myths. We're just going to keep drifting forward, nice and slow, because nothing bad is about to jump out at us. Mostly paperwork, a lot of resentment, and an entire continent quietly agreeing to bully one guy for the rest of recorded time. By the time Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, the war part of his life was effectively over. Europe had moved on to the cleanup phase. Borders were being redrawn. Monarchies were dusted off and reinstalled like old furniture pulled out of storage. And Napoleon, once the center of everything, was now a logistical problem with an address in the middle of the Atlantic. St. Helena was not glamorous. It was not strategic. It was chosen because it was boring and isolated and deeply inconvenient, which is exactly how you deal with someone who refuses to be forgotten. The British made sure he couldn't escape, couldn't influence politics, and couldn't do anything more dangerous than complain. And complain he did. Napoleon's days on St. Helena were long, repetitive, and deeply irritating to him. He woke up late. He paced. He dictated memoirs to anyone who would listen. He argued with his guards. He argued with his doctors. He argued with reality itself. This was a man who had spent decades bending Europe to his will, and now his greatest enemy was the wind. And here's where the myth really solidifies. Because when powerful people fall, the world doesn't want nuance, it wants symbolism. Napoleon stopped being a complex historical figure and became a lesson, a cautionary tale, a warning label. And nothing sells that better than making him look ridiculous. British newspapers leaned into the image hard. They described him as petulant, childish, small in every sense of the word. His physical body became shorthand for his ambition. Short equals insecure. Insecure equals aggressive. Aggressive equals dangerous. And suddenly the math was done. This is how the Napoleon complex was born. Not in psychology textbooks, not in careful studies, but in political cartoons and gossip columns written by people who had been terrified of him for 20 years and were very relieved he was gone. The irony is that Napoleon's behavior on St. Helena was not especially dramatic. He wasn't raging constantly. He wasn't throwing tantrums. He was mostly bored, annoyed, occasionally melancholy. He reminisced. He rewrote his own story.
He framed himself as a misunderstood hero, betrayed by circumstances, which, again, very human. But none of that fit the narrative. So instead, he became the eternal, short-tempered little emperor, the man whose ambition was somehow physically visible in his supposed lack of inches. And because people love simple explanations, it stuck. Let's pause here for a gentle reality check. If Napoleon had been tall, historians would have said his ambition came from arrogance. If he had been quiet, they would have said it came from cold calculation. If he had been cheerful, they would have called him manipulative. But because he was average-sized and intense, the world decided it was compensation. This pattern shows up again and again in royal history. Physical traits become moral explanations, genetics become destiny, bodies become metaphors, and accuracy quietly leaves the room. Napoleon didn't help himself, of course. He was deeply sensitive to disrespect. He demanded strict etiquette. He obsessed over titles, seating arrangements, uniforms, and symbols. He corrected people constantly. He remembered slights from years earlier. This wasn't because he was short. It was because he was insecure in a world that had never fully accepted him. He was a Corsican outsider ruling France, a revolutionary general playing emperor, a self-made man sitting on thrones built for ancient bloodlines. Every room he entered came with silent judgment, and he felt all of it. That tension shaped his personality far more than his height ever did. And yet, the myth flattened everything. By the mid-19th century, Napoleon was no longer a man. He was a stock character, a tiny tyrant, a cautionary caricature taught in schools, repeated in jokes, referenced casually. His actual achievements became footnotes. His legal reforms, military innovations, and administrative genius were overshadowed by the idea that he was just very angry about being short. This is one of history's laziest habits, reducing complicated people to a single trait, because it's easier to remember, and also because it feels satisfying. Meanwhile, real short monarchs existed, kings who were genuinely below average in height, men who ruled with calm, restraint, and stability. No one coined syndromes for them because they weren't useful villains. Napoleon was useful. He represented the chaos of revolution, the fear of social mobility, the danger of letting talented nobodies rise too high, and making him small made him less threatening in retrospect. You can laugh at him, you can dismiss him, you can pretend the terror he inspired was silly. This is where propaganda becomes emotional comfort. And here's the sleepy irony. Napoleon himself cared deeply about legacy. He curated his image obsessively. He commissioned paintings. He posed in heroic stances. He rewrote his failures as moral victories. He wanted to be remembered as a great lawgiver, a modernizer, a figure of destiny. And instead, he became a joke about height. There's something quietly tragic about that. Not in a dramatic way, just in a tired human way. The kind of tragedy where someone tries very hard to control how they're seen and loses that control completely. As decades passed, the myth evolved. Children learned about Napoleon as a short man with big ambitions. Adults used his name as shorthand for insecurity. Psychologists borrowed the term without much historical care, and no one stopped to ask if it made sense. Because by then, it didn't. The real Napoleon was gone. The myth was convenient, and convenience always wins. So when people say Napoleon complex, they're not talking about Napoleon. They're talking about how history loves to moralize bodies, how it explains power through appearance, how it turns political conflict into personality flaws. And this pattern doesn't end with Napoleon. In fact, it barely starts with him. As we gently drift forward, we're going to see this same thing happen again and again. Kings mocked for weak chins, queens blamed for genetics they didn't choose, entire dynasties reduced to physical stereotypes because it made their downfall easier to digest. History loves a visual metaphor, and royalty gives it plenty to work with.
So take another slow breath. Let your shoulders sink. Let the image of Napoleon shrink back down to what it always was, an average-sized man carrying an oversized reputation. By the time Napoleon had been reduced to a cartoon with anger issues, Europe was already very experienced at turning human bodies into political commentary. Royals had been doing it to each other for centuries. Long before newspapers and psychology terms, there were portraits, gossip, and the quiet agreement that if a ruler looked strange, it probably meant something was deeply wrong with the universe. Because, of course it did. In monarchies, bodies were not private. They were public property. They were inspected, discussed, painted, whispered about, and interpreted like omens. A strong jaw meant strength. A weak chin meant weakness. Pale skin meant refinement. Sickly skin meant divine punishment. None of this was scientific. All of it was taken very seriously. And once you start judging rulers by their faces, you really don't stop. One of the most famous examples, and one that quietly hums in the background of almost every European royal story, is the Habsburg jaw. That long, protruding chin that looks like it was slowly assembled by committee and never quite approved. It became the visual symbol of dynastic inbreeding, a genetic signature so recognizable you could spot it across paintings, centuries, and borders. The Habsburgs did not set out to become a medical case study. They just really, really liked marrying their cousins over and over for generations, because land, titles, and alliances mattered more than genetic diversity. And the result was a family tree that was less a tree and more a decorative wreath. The jaw wasn't just a physical trait. It became propaganda. Enemies pointed to it as proof of degeneration. Subjects whispered about it as a sign of decay, and historians later used it as a visual shorthand for everything wrong with dynastic rule. But here's the quiet part people forget. Many Habsburg rulers were competent, intelligent, hard-working. Some were even kind. The jaw didn't cause their political problems, but it made those problems easier to mock, just like Napoleon's height. Bodies became evidence because evidence was emotionally satisfying. You could see decline. You could see corruption. You didn't need to read tax records or understand treaties. You just looked at the chin and nodded knowingly. This habit spread everywhere. Kings with epilepsy were labeled unfit. Queens with depression were called unstable. Princes with physical disabilities were hidden away, whispered about, or quietly removed from succession. Anything that deviated from the imagined ideal royal body became a story in itself, and those stories were rarely kind. Take Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of Spain. He was so inbred that his family tree technically loops back on itself multiple times. He was sickly, weak, and struggled with basic functions. His jaw was extreme. His tongue was large. He could barely speak clearly. He couldn't produce an heir. Europe watched him like a slow-moving tragedy. His physical condition became a geopolitical countdown. When he died without children, it triggered a massive war over who got Spain. His physical condition wasn't just a personal issue, it was an international crisis. And yet, people often talk about him like a punchline, a genetic joke, a warning about cousin marriage, which is true, but also incomplete. Charles didn't choose his genetics. He didn't design his lineage. He was born into a system that prioritized control over care, and his suffering was quietly accepted as the cost of doing business. This is the kind of thing that becomes oddly soothing when you stretch it out, because it's not shocking, it's just repetitive. The same mistakes, the same patterns, the same humans pretending they're above biology. Napoleon, for all his faults, wasn't born into this system. He disrupted it, and that's part of why the old elites were so eager to mock him. He wasn't malformed by inbreeding, he was malformed by ambition, and that was somehow worse. So they attacked what they could: his size, his temper, his ego. Meanwhile, kings who were genuinely unstable were quietly protected by tradition. George III of Britain, for example, suffered from recurring mental illness. He had episodes of confusion, agitation, and hallucinations. At times, he was unfit to rule, but because he was born king, his condition was framed as tragic rather than ridiculous. Contrast that with Napoleon, whose intensity was framed as pathology. One was unfortunate, the other was dangerous. This double standard runs deep. Royal women had it even worse. Their bodies were treated as public breeding projects. Fertility was monitored obsessively. Miscarriages were political failures. Weight gain was scrutinized. Aging was a scandal. Anything less than perfect reproductive performance became evidence of moral or genetic deficiency. Marie Antoinette was mocked for years as frivolous, cold, and unnatural before the revolution even began. Her body, her spending, her supposed lack of motherhood, all were turned into symbols of corruption. By the time she was executed, she had already been reduced to a caricature. The real person barely mattered. And again, this is where the myth overtakes the human. Napoleon's myth is mild compared to what happened to many royals. He got jokes, others got erased, or pathologized, or remembered only through physical traits they couldn't control. The sleepy takeaway here isn't outrage, it's repetition. History keeps doing this, turning bodies into explanations, turning appearances into morals, turning complex systems into simple stories you can glance at and understand without thinking too hard. And maybe that's why these myths last so long. They're easy, they're visual, they let us feel smarter than the past without really engaging with it. As we float onward, we'll start to see how this obsession with bodies fed directly into marriage choices, because if bodies mattered, then bloodlines mattered even more. And if bloodlines mattered, then they needed to be controlled, carefully, strategically, repeatedly, preferably within the family. Because when you're ruling by divine right, you don't really want divine uncertainty sneaking in from outside. Royal marriages were never about love. That part is important to internalize early because it saves a lot of disappointment later. They were about territory, alliances, claims, and occasionally revenge. A bride was a treaty with a pulse. A groom was a diplomatic tool with a crown, and their children were walking contracts. This is how Europe ended up with a small, interconnected group of families marrying each other over and over, convinced they were preserving stability, while slowly concentrating genetic risks like they were collecting stamps. The logic was simple. If we keep marrying within trusted houses, we keep power contained. We keep blood pure. We avoid outsiders.
We reduce surprises, which sounds reasonable if you don't understand biology, or probability, or long-term consequences. The result was not stability, it was fragility. Take the Habsburgs again, because they're impossible to avoid. They married cousins, uncles to nieces, and second cousins to second cousins until the family tree looked like a ladder someone leaned against itself. Each generation doubled down, convinced that one more strategic marriage would fix the visible problems of the previous one. It never did. Instead, traits compounded: physical deformities, infertility, chronic illness, developmental delays, emotional instability. None of this happened all at once. It crept in slowly, politely, over centuries, which made it easier to ignore. By the time Charles II of Spain came along, the system had eaten itself. He was the end result of generations of safe marriages. And his body bore the cost. He could barely rule. He could barely function. And yet, he was still crowned king because the bloodline mattered more than the body carrying it. And when he died without heirs, Europe exploded into war because the bloodline still mattered, even when it failed completely.
This pattern wasn't limited to Spain. France, Austria, Prussia, Britain, all of them participated. Queen Victoria, often called the grandmother of Europe, spread hemophilia through royal houses via her descendants. At the time, no one understood genetics. They just knew something kept going wrong. Children kept dying, princes kept bleeding, queens kept mourning. And still, the marriages continued. Because the alternative, marrying outside the elite circle, felt riskier than repeating disasters, which is a very human mistake. Napoleon, interestingly, sat awkwardly within this system. He wasn't born into it, but he tried to force his way in. His marriage to Marie Louise of Austria was an attempt to graft himself onto old royal bloodlines, to legitimize himself biologically as well as politically. He wanted heirs with ancient names and unquestioned ancestry. It didn't work. His son, the King of Rome, never ruled. He died young. Napoleon's dynasty evaporated almost immediately. And Europe quietly returned to its old families, their old problems, and their old marriages. And yet, the myths persisted. Napoleon remained the short, angry outsider. The Habsburgs remained the cautionary tale of inbreeding. Royals remained symbols rather than people. Their bodies continued to be read like political texts. Their marriages continued to be judged by outcomes no one could fully control. What's striking when you let all of this stretch out slowly is how predictable it all was. The same decisions justified by tradition, the same consequences blamed on individuals, the same refusal to adapt until collapse forced change. Napoleon's myth survives because it's useful. Royal genetic horror stories survive because they're visual. They let us point, nod, and feel relieved we're not part of that system anymore. Even though, in quieter ways, humans still make similar choices, just with better branding. And that's really where this story settles. Not with drama, not with revelation, but a long, flat understanding that history isn't built from grand moments alone. It's built from habits, from shortcuts, from stories we repeat because they're easier than the truth. Napoleon wasn't short, he was average. Royal bloodlines weren't divine, they were human. Bodies weren't destiny, but they were treated like they were. And when enough people agree on a story, whether it's about a man's height or a family's jaw, it stops being questioned. It just becomes background noise. Which is oddly enough where all of this belongs now. A soft hum of old mistakes drifting past, no longer urgent, just there.
Let your brain power down from whatever it's been yelling about all day. Because tonight, we're drifting gently down the River Thames. Not the postcard Thames, not the one with Parliament and sunsets. The other one, the muddy, smelly, human waste adjacent Thames, and the people who made a living inside it. These were the mudlarks. And yes, that name sounds whimsical, like a bird wearing a tiny scarf. It was not that. It was cold mud, rotting trash, bare feet, and the slow realization that history throws away a lot of things, and sometimes people have to go pick them back up. So, let's settle in. Now, if you imagine the River Thames today, you probably picture tour boats, reflections, and a general vibe of expensive sandwiches. But for most of its history, the Thames was basically London's digestive system. Everything went into it. Human waste, animal remains, broken pottery, lost coins, rusted tools, dead dogs, and the occasional surprise body. The river was tidal, which meant twice a day it rose up politely, took everything, and then spat it all back out again onto the banks. And that is where the mudlarks lived, or at least worked, usually barefoot, often hungry, always damp. Mudlarking wasn't a hobby. It was not an Instagram aesthetic. It was what happened when you were poor in a city that had already decided you didn't matter. If you couldn't get factory work, dock work, or domestic service, the river was always hiring.
It didn't pay well, it paid in scraps, literally. A mudlark would wait for the tide to go out, exposing the riverbed. The mud left behind was thick, sucking, and smelled like centuries of bad decisions. And into this mess, people, often women and children, would walk, bend, scrape, and dig. They looked for anything that could be sold. Coal dropped from ships, rags, bones, nails, bits of metal, clay pipes, buttons, anything. Because anything could be money. Children were especially common mudlarks, because of course they were. History loves child labor. Small hands were useful for prying things out of the mud, and children didn't complain as much, or at least no one listened when they did. Many mudlarks were under 10 years old. Some were as young as 5, which is the age when modern kids are learning shapes, not scavenging river sludge for survival. The workday followed the tide. You had a few hours when the river was low. Miss it, and the water would come back fast. There was no gentle warning. The Thames didn't care if you were still down there. Every year people drowned, not dramatically, quietly, slipping, getting stuck, vanishing. And the mud itself was dangerous. It wasn't just dirt, it was a soup of sewage, chemicals, sharp objects, and bacteria. Cuts became infections, feet rotted, illness was constant. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all floating around like they owned the place. Which, honestly, they did. But the river also held treasures, and this is where it gets weirdly exciting, but we're going to stay calm about it. Sometimes mudlarks found coins, not many, usually small ones, but occasionally something old, Roman coins, medieval tokens, little reminders that London had been throwing things into this river for 2,000 years. The Thames was basically a timeline made of garbage. Most mudlarks worked alone or in family groups. There was competition, but also an understood understanding. Everyone was desperate. Stealing from another mudlark wasn't worth the fight. The real enemy was the river, and hunger, and winter, especially winter. Winter mudlarking was brutal. The water was icy, feet went numb, hands cracked and bled. Clothes stayed wet, and because you couldn't work docks or markets as easily in winter, more people turned to the river, which meant more competition for less trash. A classic economic system. Victorian society, being Victorian society, had opinions about mudlarks, mostly that they were disgusting. Newspapers described them as half-wild creatures, barely human, emerging from the mud like something that should not legally exist. Charles Dickens, who loved writing about poor children while also being extremely rich, described mudlarks with a mix of pity and fascination. They were symbols, not people, which was convenient. There were attempts to help mudlarks, usually in the form of moral lectures or laws, or both. In the early 19th century, authorities tried to regulate who could work on the river. You needed a license, because nothing says solution like paperwork for starving children. Of course, this just pushed the poorest further out. They worked illegally, they got chased off, sometimes beaten, sometimes arrested, sometimes just ignored. And the river kept doing its thing. Mudlarks didn't find only objects, they found stories. A broken teacup from a wealthy home, a military button from a dead soldier, a ring that had once meant something. Each item had lived a full life before ending up face down in the mud, and the mudlark was the final witness. Many mudlarks sold their finds to bone pickers or junk dealers. These middlemen made the real money. They sorted, resold, recycled. Capitalism was alive and well in the mud. If you were lucky, a day's work might earn you a few pennies. Enough for bread, maybe coal, rarely more. There was no upward mobility, no success stories, no mudlark who made it. If you stopped mudlarking, it usually meant you died, or got too sick to walk, or found another equally terrible job.
Women mudlarks were common, especially widows. London was full of them. Men died in factories, wars, ships, and accidents. Their wives were left with children and no income. The river didn't care if you were grieving. It just kept dropping trash. Pregnant women worked the mud. Old women worked the mud. People with missing fingers worked the mud. The Thames accepted everyone. It was very inclusive that way. And then there were the smells. You cannot talk about the Thames without the smells. In the 19th century, the river was so polluted that it became a public health crisis. The Great Stink of 1858 was exactly what it sounds like. Hot weather, low water, sewage concentrated. Parliament literally couldn't function because the smell was too strong, which is the most British problem imaginable. Mudlarks lived in this smell every day. It soaked into clothes, skin, hair. You couldn't wash it off. Even if you bathed, it came back. The smell marked you. People could tell where you'd been, which meant discrimination followed you everywhere. Shops refused service. Employers turned you away. You smelled like the river, and that was enough. As engineering improved, the river slowly changed. Sewage systems were built. The Thames became less of an open sewer, which is great for public health, but terrible for mudlarks, because the trash changed. There was less loose coal, less valuable debris. Industrialization cleaned some things while breaking others. By the late 19th century, mudlarking as a profession began to fade, not because poverty ended, it didn't, but because the river stopped giving enough back. People moved to other forms of scavenging, dust heaps, landfills, streets. Poverty doesn't disappear, it just relocates. Today, mudlarking still exists, technically, but now it's a hobby. You need permits, you wear gloves, you take photos, you find Roman pottery and feel connected to history, which is fine, but it's also strange to remember that for centuries this wasn't romantic, it was survival. The original mudlarks didn't think about history, they thought about dinner. They didn't care who dropped the coin, only that it's still spent. They didn't marvel at the past, they scraped it up and sold it by weight. And that's the quiet tragedy of it. History gets preserved in museums, but the people who handled it, who pulled it from the mud with numb fingers and empty stomachs, are mostly forgotten. Their names aren't recorded, their lives aren't commemorated. They were temporary, like the tide. So as the river comes back in, slowly covering the mud again, we'll drift with it. Because there's more down here, more people, more quiet, exhausting lives built around whatever society threw away. When you're ready, we can keep going. Same river, same slow water. Nothing sudden, nothing loud. Just the Thames doing what it has always done, which is move very slowly while quietly ruining people's lives. Last time we talked about mudlarks general. Tonight we're going to drift a little closer to the smallest figures on the riverbank, the ones bent too low, the ones who probably shouldn't have been there at all, which naturally means we're talking about children, because if history can make a job worse, it will usually add children to it. Now, Victorian London loved children, in theory, in paintings, in poems, in carefully posed charity pamphlets. In reality, children were seen as useful, cheap, bendy labor units who complained less than adults and could fit into smaller, more miserable spaces, chimneys, factories, mines, and yes, mud. A child mudlark's day began early, not because they were eager, but because the tide waits for no one. You worked when the water went out. If that was at dawn, congratulations. If it was in the middle of the night,
well, that was your problem. Parents, if they were around, often sent children alone because one extra set of hands meant one extra chance at food. These kids didn't wear shoes. Shoes were expensive and pointless. The mud would eat them anyway. Bare feet were numb most of the year. In winter, they barely worked at all. Children learned to walk without feeling. It's not poetic, it's just practical. They carried sacks or baskets or whatever they could find, and they scanned the mud constantly, eyes trained to spot anything unnatural, a glint, a shape, a line that didn't belong. They became experts in trash, professional archaeologists of other people's waste. Coal was the most common find. Ships transporting coal dropped it constantly. A single lump could mean heat or food if sold. Children competed fiercely for it. Fights happened. Quiet ones. No screaming, just pushing, grabbing, pulling sacks away. Adults rarely intervened unless it affected them. Children also found bones, lots of bones. Animal bones mostly. Dogs, horses, cows. The city went through animals at an impressive rate. Bones were valuable because they could be sold for fertilizer or glue, which means a child holding a sack of bones was technically contributing to industrial production, which is depressing but very on brand for the era. Some children mudlarks were orphans, some were not. Some had parents working alongside them. Some were rented out in a way. Adults would take in poor children, feed them just enough to survive, and send them to work the river. Whatever they earned went to the adult. It was foster care, but worse. Disease was constant. Cuts from glass or metal were unavoidable. Infection followed. There was no antiseptic, no clean water, no doctor unless you were already dying, and even then, probably not.
Many children developed chronic illnesses, coughs that never left, skin conditions that never healed, bodies that aged too fast. And yet, there were moments of strange normalcy. Children played on the riverbank. They joked. They made games out of who found the weirdest object. Childhood didn't disappear. It just got muddy and colder and shorter. Victorian reformers loved writing about mudlark children. They were excellent material, tragic, photogenic in a grim way. Writers described them as half-savage or river imps, which says more about the writers than the kids. The goal was usually to inspire charity or moral panic, or both. Occasionally, something happened. A school was opened. A mission sent workers to save the children. This usually involved removing them from the river and placing them in institutions. Some were genuinely helped, many were not. Institutions were overcrowded, underfunded, and strict. You traded mud for rules, hunger for discipline. Some children ran away, back to the river. At least there you knew the dangers. You knew when the tide came in. You knew how to survive. Institutions were unpredictable. The river was honest. As the 19th century moved on, laws slowly changed. Child labor laws were introduced, enforced unevenly, often ignored. The poorest children were the hardest to protect because protection required resources, and society was very careful about who deserved those. By the time photography became common, images of mudlark children began to circulate. Small figures standing ankle-deep in sludge, staring at the camera with expressions that weren't sad so much as tired, very tired. These images shocked the middle class for a while. Then they moved on, and the children grew up, or didn't. Those who survived childhood mudlarking rarely escaped poverty.
Their bodies were worn early, their health fragile. Many moved into dock work, street selling, or other forms of scavenging. The river had trained them well. It had not prepared them for comfort. Now, while children were the most visible mudlarks, they weren't the only ones living strange lives along the Thames. The river attracted entire communities, people who existed slightly outside normal society. Let's drift toward them. Along the banks were informal settlements, shacks, lean-tos, converted boats. People lived close to the river because work was there, also because no one wanted the land. Flooding was common, fires too, but rent was cheap when the ground itself tried to kill you. These communities had their own rhythms, their own rules. People shared information about tides, patrols, good spots. There was mutual aid, but limited. Everyone was struggling. Generosity had limits. Crime was part of the ecosystem. Theft, smuggling, fencing stolen goods. The river was a highway. Things moved in and out constantly. Mudlarks were sometimes accused of stealing from ships. Sometimes they did. Mostly they didn't need to. The river provided enough without adding risk. Authorities treated river people with suspicion. They were seen as dirty, dishonest, and morally questionable, which made it easier to ignore their deaths. Drownings were common. Bodies were pulled from the Thames regularly, sometimes identified, often not. Just another problem solved by paperwork. One strange irony is that mudlarks were deeply knowledgeable of London's history without ever meaning to be. They found layers, objects from different centuries mixed together, a Roman coin next to a Georgian shoe buckle. Time collapsed in the mud. But this knowledge wasn't valued. It couldn't be monetized in a respectable way, so it stayed in their heads. As the river cleaned up and industry changed, the need for mudlarks declined, which sounds positive, but again, poverty doesn't end, it shifts. Children moved into factories, adults into warehouses. The river lost its scavengers, but the city kept its poor. By the early 20th century, the term mudlark had already begun to romanticize. Writers looked back nostalgically. Artists painted soft, misty scenes. The danger was gone in the telling. The smell vanished, the hunger too. All that remained was atmosphere, which is usually how history works. Today, modern mudlarkers carefully search the Thames with permits and gloves, hoping to find a fragment of the past. And they do, but they are looking for history. The original mudlarks were looking for dinner. That difference matters. So, as the tide turns again and the river slowly covers everything we've talked about, we'll let it. The Thames has always preferred to keep its secrets buried. But there are still more lives tangled up in its flow, more quiet, exhausted people who built London without ever being thanked for it. So we'll stay with the river a little longer, not wrapping anything up too neatly, not tucking anyone in, just letting the Thames do what it's always done, which is move forward without caring who falls behind. By the late 19th century, the mudlarks were slowly disappearing, but not in a dramatic way. There was no final generation, no last official mudlark who packed up his sack and said goodbye to the river. It just thinned out. Fewer people came down at low tide, fewer bare feet in the mud, fewer children crouched over the sludge, scanning for something that might buy bread. The river was changing, and so was London. Engineers built embankments, sewage systems improved. The Thames stopped being a floating toilet and started becoming, at least on paper, a respectable river. which is a very polite way of saying the trash got harder to find. And when the trash disappears, so do the people who depended on it. Former mudlarks drifted into other margins. Some became dock laborers if they were strong enough. Some sold scrap in the streets. Some begged. Some disappeared into workhouses, which were never an improvement, just a different flavor of misery. Old mudlarks didn't retire. They wore out.
The river, meanwhile, quietly kept everything it had been given. Because even when the surface looked cleaner, the mud below stayed layered. Objects sank, stories piled up, centuries compressed into a thick, sticky archive that no one planned but everyone contributed to. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. London, one of the most powerful cities in the world, built its wealth on trade, empire, and industry. And all the leftovers of that success flowed straight into the Thames. The broken bits, the used-up tools, the disposable objects, and sometimes the disposable people. Mudlarks were never meant to be permanent. They existed because society failed to deal with its waste responsibly. When the system finally adjusted, they weren't thanked, they were simply no longer needed. History does that a lot. It fixes a problem and forgets the humans who lived inside it. There's also something quietly unsettling about how much of London's past passed through the hands of people who were never allowed to claim it. Mudlarks touched Roman coins, medieval buckles, Tudor pipes. They held pieces of history that now sit behind glass in museums. But back then, those objects were just potential money. They didn't symbolize greatness, they symbolized survival. And that's probably the most honest relationship anyone has ever had with history. As modern archaeology developed, scholars realized how rich the Thames was as a historical site. Layers upon layers of artifacts, a continuous record of human life. Suddenly, the river was important, valuable, worth protecting. And again, the people who had known this all along were gone. Today's mudlarks, licensed, gloved, carefully regulated, often talk about feeling connected to the past, about imagining who dropped an object and why. That curiosity is a privilege. The original mudlarks didn't have time for imagination. They didn't wonder who lost the shoe buckle, they wondered how much it weighed. There's a temptation to romanticize them, to picture rugged survivors living freely by the river, close to nature, untamed by society. That version is comforting. It's also wrong. They weren't free. They were trapped in a system where the river was the only option left. And yet, despite everything, they adapted. They learned the tides. They memorized the river's moods. They built lives, however fragile, around something most people avoided. That takes a quiet kind of resilience, not the heroic kind, the exhausted kind. The Thames itself never acknowledged them. Rivers don't do gratitude. It flooded their homes, it drowned their neighbors, it poisoned their water, and it fed them scraps just often enough to keep them coming back. A very unhealthy relationship, honestly. If you walk along the Thames today, you won't see them. You'll see joggers, tourists, cyclists, cafes. You might see a hobbyist mudlarker crouched politely with a small trowel, carefully following the rules. The past feels distant, sanitized, but it's still there, under your feet, under the embankments, under the carefully managed image of a modern city. The mud hasn't gone anywhere, it's just been paved over. And that's really what this story is about. Not just mudlarks, but the way societies build over discomfort, how we cover the evidence of desperation with progress and call it improvement. Sometimes it is improvement, often it is, but the cost doesn't vanish, it just stops being visible. The mudlarks remind us that history isn't only made by kings, parliaments, or engineers.
It's also made by people crouching in cold sludge, picking through what others discarded. People whose lives didn't leave records but left traces, literal ones, embedded in the riverbed. They didn't shape history intentionally, they were shaped by it, and in return, they shaped the city in small, invisible ways. They kept waste moving, they recycled before it was a concept, they survived where survival wasn't supposed to happen, and then they faded out of the story, which is usually how it goes. The Thames keeps flowing, it always has. It carried Roman ships, medieval sewage, industrial runoff, and the quiet footsteps of people who lived at the very bottom of a very tall society. It doesn't distinguish between them. Everything ends up the same way, mixed, buried, waiting. So the next time someone talks about history like it's clean and orderly, like progress moves in straight lines, you can think of the mudlarks. Bent figures at low tide, hands numb, eyes scanning, lives balanced between hunger and the water coming back in. Not heroic, not dramatic, just human. And the river rolls on.
Story is not about battles or heroes or shocking twists. It's about work. Boring, repetitive, industrial work. The kind that hums quietly in the background of history while people's lives slowly fall apart. Which is perfect bedtime material, honestly. Tonight we're talking about phossy jaw, a disease so unpleasant that even Victorian factory owners occasionally felt a flicker of guilt. Just a flicker, though. Don't get too optimistic. This is a story about matchsticks, cheap labor, and a world that really wanted fire on demand but didn't care much who paid the price for it. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's gently drift back to a time when striking a match could quietly ruin someone's entire life. To understand phossy jaw, we have to start with something very small and very ordinary, the matchstick. A thin sliver of wood, a simple chemical reaction, fire whenever you wanted it. Before matches, fire was annoying. You needed flint, steel, patience, and usually a bad mood. Matches changed that. Suddenly, lighting a candle or stove took seconds. No sparks flying everywhere, no dramatic scraping. Just strike and go. People loved it, society loved it, industry loved it, and as usual, the price was paid by people whose names were never written down. By the early 1800s, match production was booming across Europe and later the United States. Factories sprang up in England, France, Austria, and beyond. These weren't glamorous places. They were long rooms filled with wooden tables, buckets of chemicals, and rows of workers doing the same tiny motion all day. Dip, shake, dry, repeat. Hour after hour, day after day. This work was often done by women and children because they were cheaper and easier to control. Also because nobody seemed too concerned about their long-term health, or short-term health, or current health. The key ingredient was white phosphorus. It was amazing stuff chemically speaking. It ignited easily, burned hot, and made matches reliable. It also happened to be extremely toxic. But that part was inconvenient, so it was largely ignored. Inside factories, white phosphorus was everywhere. It coated the tips of matches. It floated invisibly in the air as fumes. It settled on clothes, hair, and skin. Workers inhaled it for hours at a time. They swallowed tiny amounts without realizing it. It clung to them long after their shifts ended, riding home on their breath and bodies. And slowly, quietly, it began to do what phosphorus does best when introduced into a human body. It started breaking things down. At first, the symptoms were mild. Toothaches, swollen gums, a strange metallic taste in the mouth. Nothing that would justify missing work, especially if missing work meant not eating. Factory doctors, when they existed at all, shrugged. Tooth pain was common. Infections happened. Everyone had problems. Keep working. But the pain didn't stop. It deepened. Teeth loosened. Gums receded. Abscesses formed along the jaw. And beneath it all, the bone itself began to die.
This is where Jaw really enters the room. Jaw, officially known as phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, was exactly what it sounds like. The jawbone literally started rotting. The phosphorus interfered with blood supply to the bone. Without blood, bone tissue died, and dead bone does not behave politely. It crumbled, it broke apart, it became infected, it smelled. People described a sweet, sickly odor that followed victims everywhere. A smell you couldn't wash off, a smell that announced you before you spoke. Sometimes in dark rooms, exposed jawbones would faintly glow. White phosphorus is luminescent. Imagine noticing that your face was softly shining in the dark, not in a magical way, in a deeply unsettling, medically alarming way. And then imagine going to work the next morning anyway. Victims suffered horribly, but slowly. This was not a dramatic collapse, this was a long decline. Pain became constant, eating became difficult, then impossible. Pieces of jawbone fell out, not metaphorically, literally. Small fragments would detach and emerge through the gums. Sometimes surgeons attempted to help by cutting away dead bone without anesthesia, because anesthesia was still a bit of a work in progress, and pain relief was considered optional for the working poor. Survival didn't mean recovery. Many lived disfigured, missing large portions of their lower face. Speech became slurred, saliva dripped constantly. Social isolation followed. Employers fired workers who looked too sick. Landlords complained. Families struggled to care for someone who could no longer eat normally or work. And still, matches had to be made. Factory owners were not confused about what was happening. They knew phosphorus was dangerous. They knew workers were getting sick. They also knew that safer alternatives were more expensive. Red phosphorus existed. It was far less toxic. It also cost more and harder to use. Switching would cut into profits, and that, obviously, was unacceptable. So, instead, factories blamed the workers. They said Jaw was caused by poor hygiene, bad teeth, weak constitutions, moral failings somehow. Workers were advised to rinse their mouths, to keep cleaner, to not be so poor, presumably. Protective equipment was rare, ventilation was minimal, and wages stayed low enough that leaving the job wasn't really an option. Children were especially vulnerable. Many started working in match factories before their teenage years. Their bones were still developing. Their exposure lasted longer. Some developed symptoms shockingly fast. Toothaches at 12, jaw necrosis at 14, by 16 already permanently disfigured. This was considered tragic, but not tragic enough to shut anything down. By the mid-19th century, jaw was common enough to be recognized as an occupational disease. Doctors wrote about it. Reformers campaigned against it. Newspapers occasionally published horrifying descriptions. And then, after the article ended, readers lit their lamps with matches and went on with their evenings. One of the strange things about jaw is how visible it was. This wasn't lung damage hidden inside the chest. This wasn't slow organ failure you could politely ignore. This was right there, on people's faces. Missing jaws, bandaged mouths, sunken cheeks. Yet society managed to look away remarkably well. Factory owners sometimes offered small compensations, a little money, a dismissal framed as concern. In rare cases, they paid for surgery. Mostly, though, they replaced workers as easily as broken tools. There was always someone else desperate enough to take the job, someone with healthy teeth, for now. In Britain, public pressure eventually began to build. The Match Girls' strike of 1888 was a turning point. Young women working at the Bryant and May factory in London protested low pay, long hours, and dangerous conditions. Jaw was part of their reality, even if not everyone was openly suffering yet. The strike gained public sympathy. Journalists wrote about conditions inside the factory. People were briefly uncomfortable. And, surprisingly, things began to change. Slowly, painfully slowly. Regulations were discussed. Inspections increased. Some factories introduced better ventilation. A few experimented with safer chemicals, but white phosphorus remained stubbornly present. It was cheap, and cheap tends to win for a long time. International pressure finally helped. In 1906, several countries signed the Berne Convention, agreeing to ban white phosphorus in match production. This didn't magically end suffering overnight. Enforcement took time. Some factories ignored the rules. Others found loopholes. But gradually, Phossy Jaw began to fade from common experience. By the early 20th century, safer matches became standard. Red phosphorus replaced white. The disease that had destroyed thousands of faces quietly retreated into medical textbooks and footnotes. It stopped being something people saw every day. And when something stops being visible, it often stops being remembered. Today, Phossy Jaw sounds unreal, like something invented to scare people. A glowing, rotting jaw caused by making matches feels exaggerated. Surely someone would have stepped in sooner. Surely this couldn't have gone on for decades. But it did, because it was boring, because it happened to poor people, because it was the background hum of progress. And that's the thing to gently sit with as you drift towards sleep. History isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself with wars or coronations. Sometimes it's a quiet factory room, a repetitive motion, a toothache that doesn't go away, and a world that decides this is acceptable, at least for now. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the lives of the workers themselves, the daily routines, the factory floors, the small human moments inside a system that slowly destroyed them. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic, just the long, soft grind of industrial life. Same calm pace, same low energy, nothing urgent. In fact, the people we're talking about would have appreciated urgency, but they didn't get much of it. What they got instead was routine, endless, repetitive routine. And that's where we'll stay for a while. A typical day in a 19th century match factory began early, unreasonably early, before the sun, before the body was ready, before anyone had finished being tired from the day before. Workers, many of them girls barely into their teens, would shuffle in wearing the same clothes they'd worn yesterday, clothes already dusted with phosphorus residue that never quite washed out. It clung to fabric the way bad decisions cling to dynasties. Inside the factory, the air was heavy, not smoky exactly, but thick, slightly sweet, slightly sharp. The kind of smell you notice at first and then stop noticing, which is always a bad sign. Windows existed, technically, but they were often shut to keep the room warm, or to prevent drafts from messing up the delicate chemical process. Ventilation was considered optional, like comfort or safety. The work itself was mind-numbingly simple. That was part of its appeal to factory owners. No training required, no education. You could take someone straight off the street and have them productive within minutes. Wooden sticks arrived in bundles. They were dipped into a paste containing white phosphorus, sulfur, and glue. The worker would dip, shake off the excess, and lay them out to dry. Over and over, thousands of times a day. This was not work that rewarded thinking. In fact, thinking probably made it worse. The best way to survive the day was to let your mind drift, count dips, hum quietly, daydream, anything to avoid focusing on the ache in your back, the sting in your eyes, or the taste in your mouth that never quite went away, that metallic tang, like sucking on a coin, a small warning sign that no one explained to you. Breaks were short. Lunch was eaten at the workstation more often than not. Hands that had just been in phosphorus paste touched bread. Fingers wiped mouths. Nobody washed properly because there usually wasn't anywhere to do so. Even when there was, time was money, and money was already in short supply. So exposure continued, bite by bite, breath by breath. Supervisors walked the floor, watching for speed, not health. If you slowed down, you were reminded that plenty of others were waiting for your job. If you complained of pain, you were told to toughen up. Pain was normal. Everyone had pain. Pain meant you were working, and working meant you were useful. The earliest visible sign of phossy jaw was often dental trouble. Teeth became sensitive, gums swelled and bled. Workers learned to live with it. Toothaches were common in the 19th century anyway. Dentistry was not exactly a golden age. Losing teeth was practically expected. So when pain started, it didn't immediately raise alarms.
But then it didn't stop. The swelling worsened. Pus formed along the gums. The jaw stiffened. Opening the mouth became difficult. And still, people came to work, because the alternative was worse. No wages meant no food, no rent, no survival. Employers knew this. The system depended on it. Eventually, the pain crossed a threshold. Sleep became impossible. Eating became agony. Faces swelled unevenly. Abscesses broke open, releasing foul-smelling discharge. At this stage, co-workers noticed. The smell was distinctive, sweet, rotting, impossible to ignore. People would quietly shift away, not out of cruelty exactly, more out of fear. If you stood too close, would it happen to you faster? Some workers tried home remedies, rinses, poultices, alcohol, prayer, anything that might slow what was happening inside their faces. Very few sought doctors early on. Doctors cost money, and many factory doctors were employed by the factory itself, which meant their loyalty was flexible. When medical attention finally came, it was often too late. The diagnosis was blunt. The jawbone was dead. It had to be removed, sometimes partially, sometimes entirely. Surgery in the mid-1800s was not gentle. Anesthesia was unreliable or unavailable. Procedures were brutal and fast. Surgeons cut away necrotic bone while patients were held down. The goal was speed, not comfort. Surviving surgery did not mean returning to normal life. Without a jaw, eating solid food was nearly impossible. Speech was impaired. Faces collapsed inward. People avoided mirrors. Society avoided them. Disfigurement carried stigma, especially for women. Many could not find work afterward. The very job that destroyed them had been the only one available. And yet, factories continued to hire new workers, fresh faces, healthy jaws, clean slates. Children were everywhere in these factories, not as apprentices, as labor. Small hands were useful. They could dip faster, reach tighter spaces, endure longer hours for less pay. And children didn't complain as effectively. They accepted discomfort as normal because it was all they knew. For them, phossy jaw was especially cruel. Developing bones absorbed phosphorus readily. Progress progressed faster. Some children showed advanced symptoms within a few years. There are records of teenagers undergoing jaw removal surgeries. Teenagers trying to grow up without half their face. Parents knew the risks, at least vaguely, but poverty doesn't leave many choices. Sending a child to a match factory could mean the difference between eating and not eating, between rent and eviction, between survival and collapse. So they sent them and hoped. Hope did a lot of heavy lifting in the 19th century. Factory owners, meanwhile, cultivated ignorance, or at least plausible deniability. They funded studies that downplayed risks. They pointed to workers who never developed symptoms as proof that the job was safe. They blamed personal hygiene, bad teeth, poor diets, anything except the glowing toxic substance coating every surface. There were moments of resistance. Workers talked, rumors spread. Some refused certain tasks, others quit if they could afford to. But collective action was dangerous. Unions were weak or non-existent. Striking meant starvation, and employers had the law, the money, and the police on their side. The match girls' strike we mentioned earlier didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of quiet suffering, years of watching co-workers deteriorate, years of being told it was their fault.
When the strike finally happened, it shocked the public, not because conditions were new, but because they were suddenly visible. Newspapers described young women with bandaged jaws, missing teeth, hollowed cheeks. Middle-class readers were disturbed. This wasn't how progress was supposed to look. Industrialization was meant to make life better, easier, more civilized. Not this. Public sympathy was real, but shallow. Enough to demand reform, not always enough to enforce it. Some factories improved conditions just enough to deflect criticism. Better lighting, slightly shorter hours, mouthwash stations, which was something, I guess. But white phosphorus remained. What's striking, in a quiet way, is how long this went on even after safer alternatives existed. Red phosphorus matches worked, they just cost more. And that was the deciding factor. The health of workers was weighed against profit margins, and profit margins won, again and again and again. Eventually, international agreements forced change. The Berne Convention made white phosphorus illegal in many countries. Factories adapted. Phossy jaw cases declined. The disease slowly vanished from living memory. By the time antibiotics and modern surgery arrived, the worst was already over. But the people who suffered didn't get that future. They lived out their lives marked by a job that promised survival and delivered ruin. Their stories didn't make it into textbooks. They weren't famous. They didn't leave portraits behind. Mostly, they disappeared quietly. Which is kind of how industrial suffering works. It hums, it repeats, it doesn't climax, it just happens. Until it doesn't. And by then, everyone has moved on. In the next part, we'll gently zoom out. We'll look at how society talked about phossy jaw, how doctors, reformers, and governments tried to explain it away, and how progress always seems to arrive only after enough people have already been broken by the old way. By the time phossy jaw began to disappear, it wasn't because the world suddenly became kinder. It was because the problem had become inconvenient, too visible, too documented, too embarrassing for a society that liked to think of itself as modern, rational, and improving. Progress, after all, prefers a clean narrative, and rotting jaws didn't fit very well into that story. Doctors had been aware of phosphorus poisoning for years. Medical journals in the mid-1800s described cases in clinical, detached language. They wrote about necrosis, abscesses, bone death. They sketched diagrams of damaged jaws. They debated mechanisms. What they didn't debate, for a long time, was whether factories should stop using white phosphorus altogether. That question lived uncomfortably close to economics. Instead, many early medical responses focused on mitigation. How could workers be made safer without changing production? Better ventilation, shorter shifts, dental checks, mouth rinses. Some factories required workers to brush their teeth before shifts, as if cleanliness alone could cancel out daily exposure to a toxic chemical. It was a very Victorian solution, moral hygiene over structural change. Doctors employed by factories were in an especially awkward position. Their job was to keep workers productive, not necessarily healthy. When phossy jaw appeared, they often delayed diagnosis or labeled it something else: tooth infection, gum disease, anything that avoided linking it directly to phosphorus. Because once that link was undeniable, responsibility followed, and responsibility was expensive. Independent physicians and reformers, however, were less constrained. They visited factories, interviewed workers, documented cases. They noticed patterns that were impossible to ignore. Entire communities near match factories had higher rates of jaw necrosis. Workers who left the industry often stabilized. Those who stayed worsened. The connection became undeniable to anyone willing to look directly at it. Public health campaigns began to form, though campaign might be too energetic a word. This was more like persistent nagging, articles, pamphlets, parliamentary questions, slow bureaucratic pressure. Reformers didn't shout, they explained, over and over and over, which is sometimes more effective, if much more exhausting. Factory owners responded defensively. They questioned the science. They funded counter-studies. They emphasized that not all workers got sick, which was technically true and morally irrelevant. They insisted that banning white phosphorus would destroy the industry. Jobs would be lost. Prices would rise. Society would suffer. Matches, apparently, were holding civilization together. Governments hesitated. Regulation meant interference, and interference meant backlash from powerful industrial interests. So instead of bans, they introduced partial measures, age restrictions, safety guidelines, inspection regimes that looked impressive on paper and weak in practice. Inspectors were underfunded, factories prepared for visits in advance, problems were temporarily hidden. Everyone nodded politely and moved on. Meanwhile, workers continued to suffer, at a reduced rate perhaps, but still enough to matter. And the disease retained its strange power to horrify. When people saw it firsthand, it unsettled them. There was something uniquely disturbing about facial destruction. It challenged ideas of identity, of humanity. You could lose a hand and still be recognized, lose your jaw, and people struggled to look at you. This visibility turned out to be Fossijaw's most effective weapon. Middle-class reformers could ignore lung disease. They could ignore back injuries, but faces were harder. Faces looked back at you. Faces asked questions without speaking. Eventually, international cooperation forced the issue. The Berne Convention of 1906 wasn't born out of sudden compassion. It was the result of decades of pressure, evidence, and an uncomfortable realization that safer alternatives already existed. Red phosphorus matches worked. Other countries were using them. The argument that white phosphorus was indispensable began to collapse. Countries agreed, reluctantly, to ban white phosphorus in match production. Enforcement varied. Some complied quickly, others dragged their feet. But the direction was set. Factories adapted. The cost was absorbed. The industry survived. Civilization did not collapse due to slightly more expensive matches. Fossijaw cases declined steadily. New workers no longer faced the same risk. Older workers lived with the damage already done. Surgeons continued to treat the consequences long after the cause was removed. Entire generations bore scars that newer ones would never fully understand. By the 1920s, Fossijaw had become rare. By the 1930s, it was mostly historical. Medical students learned about it as a cautionary tale, an example of occupational disease, an illustration in textbooks, something that happened back then when standards were lower and people didn't know better, which is partially true. People did know better. Enough people knew. The problem wasn't ignorance, it was priority. What's quietly unsettling is how familiar the pattern feels. Dangerous substance introduced, workers exposed, early warning signs ignored, blame shifted onto individuals, regulation delayed. Arrives only after damage becomes undeniable. Then, eventually, the story ends, not with justice exactly, but with replacement, the hazard removed, the victims remembered briefly, then forgotten. There were no monuments to match workers, no national days of remembrance, no great apologies. Their contribution was absorbed into the background of industrial progress. We remember the convenience, we forget the cost. That's how most systems prefer it. Fossijaw also reshaped how occupational health was understood. It helped establish the idea that work itself could be the cause of disease, not just the setting. That employers bore responsibility for long-term harm, not just immediate accidents. These ideas seem obvious now. At the time, they were radical. And yet, even as laws changed, the deeper logic remained. Industries continued to test limits. Workers continued to absorb risks. New chemicals replaced old ones. New hazards emerged. The jaw stopped glowing, but something else started breaking instead. Today, Jaw feels distant, almost unreal, a disease from a grimy, careless past. But its story is less about phosphorus and more about how suffering becomes acceptable when it's gradual, repetitive, and inconvenient to address. It's about how systems rely on endurance, on people pushing through pain because stopping feels worse. And the matchstick itself remains cheap, reliable, taken for granted. Few people think about its history when they strike one. That tiny flame doesn't carry memory. It doesn't glow with the faces it cost. It just burns briefly and goes out. And maybe that's the final quiet irony of Jaw. The fire was never the dangerous part. It was everything around it. The air, the routine, the silence, the long stretch of time where everyone knew enough, but not enough to stop. And then, one day, it did stop. Not with a dramatic ending, just a slow fade, like so many things in history.
Let your brain slow down. Because tonight, we're drifting back through time to answer a question that almost nobody bothered to write down properly. How did people deal with periods before modern products existed? No plastic, no wings, no discreet aisle at the pharmacy. Just humans, gravity, and a lot of improvisation. This is one of those topics that sounds intense, but we're not going to make it intense. No shock, no gross-out drama, just a long, slow wander through history where people quietly bled once a month and mostly pretended it wasn't happening, which, honestly, is very on brand for humanity. To start, we need to get something out of the way. For most of history, periods were not discussed openly, recorded clearly, or explained with any real curiosity. They were something that happened, was vaguely annoying, possibly sinful, and best handled quietly in the background. Men didn't write about it much. Women didn't always have the luxury of writing anything at all, and when it does show up in historical sources, it's usually wrapped in superstition, medical confusion, or extremely bad advice. So what we're doing tonight is piecing together clues, medical texts, household records, laundry instructions, religious rules, and the occasional very tired-sounding medieval doctor who clearly had no idea what was going on but still felt confident enough to write a book about it. Let's float way back, before medieval castles, before royal courts, before anyone was pretending to understand anatomy. Early humans, ancient societies, hunter-gatherers, no written records, but a lot of common sense, or at least what passed for it. The simplest answer is that many people probably did very little. They let it happen. Cloth, animal skins, grass, moss, fur, things that absorbed, things that were already nearby. And when those things got dirty, they were washed, reused, or thrown away. There's a persistent myth that women in ancient times just bled freely and didn't care. That's not really true. Humans don't love being uncomfortable. They especially don't love ruining their clothes, their sleeping areas, or attracting attention from predators. So while there was probably less intervention than today, there was still management, just quieter, less refined, and definitely not scented. Ancient Egypt is one of the first places where we get slightly clearer hints. Egyptians were oddly practical about bodies compared to many later cultures. They used linen for everything: clothing, bandages, burial wrappings, and, yes, menstrual management. Some historians believe rolled-up strips of linen were used internally or externally. Not comfortable, not ideal, but functional enough. Linen was washable, reusable, and already part of daily life. No pink packaging required. And because this is Egypt, there were also beliefs layered on top. Menstrual blood was sometimes seen as powerful, sometimes dangerous, sometimes medicinal, depending on who you asked.
There are mammalian medical papyri that include menstrual references mixed in with spells and herbal remedies, which tells us one important thing. Nobody fully understood what was happening, but everyone had opinions about it. Now let's drift over to ancient Greece, where philosophy flourished and understanding of women's bodies did not. Greek physicians like Hippocrates believed menstruation was a way for women to expel excess blood. Because women were thought to be wetter, softer, and generally leakier than men. That's not me being sarcastic, that's literally how they framed it. Periods were considered necessary, healthy, but also something that made women unstable, irrational, and prone to emotional outbursts. So, very balanced thinking. In terms of management, Greek women likely used wool pads held in place with belts or ties. Wool was common, absorbent, and unpleasant in ways we don't need to dwell on too much. These would be washed and reused. Privacy was limited, laundry was physical labor, and menstruation was something to endure quietly, without complaint. Complaining would have been seen as dramatic, which, again, very on brand. Roman society didn't improve things much, but it did add bureaucracy. Roman women also used cloth, linen, wool, whatever was available. There are references to pessaries, which were inserted items meant to absorb or block flow. Sometimes these were made of soft material, sometimes soaked in vinegar or herbs, which sounds soothing if you don't think about it too hard. Romans had a deeply conflicted relationship with menstruation. On one hand, it was natural and expected. On the other, it was thought to have strange powers. Pliny the Elder wrote that menstrual blood could dull mirrors, kill crops, and drive dogs mad, because of course it could. This didn't stop menstruation from happening, but it did mean menstruating people were sometimes restricted from certain religious or social activities, not because of hygiene, but because vibes were off, apparently. As we slide into the early medieval period, things get quieter. Fewer written records, more church influence, more shame. Menstruation becomes increasingly moralized. Biblical texts describing menstruating women as unclean were taken very seriously. This didn't mean women disappeared once a month, but it did mean they were often excluded from church services or required to follow purification rituals afterward. In practical terms, medieval women used rags. This is where the term "on the rag" comes from. Literally scraps of cloth, old linen, torn garments, anything absorbent. These were folded, layered, and tied in place with belts or pins. There was no standardized shape, no size chart, just trial, error, and experience. For poorer women, options were limited. Cloth was valuable. Laundry was labor-intensive. Some likely used very little protection and relied on timing, staying close to home, or wearing darker garments. For wealthier women, there were more rags, more underlayers, more servants to handle laundry, which is not glamorous, but it is slightly more convenient. Royal women, despite their silk dresses and ceremonial lives, were not exempt. Queens bled, princesses bled, and it was managed discreetly by ladies-in-waiting who absolutely did not write memoirs about it. There are household accounts listing linens being washed more frequently, extra cloth purchased, or certain garments rotated. It's all very subtle, very British about it, even before Britain was fully doing its thing. There's also the matter of frequency. Many women in the past menstruated less often than modern women, due to earlier pregnancies, longer breastfeeding periods, poorer nutrition, and higher physical labor. So while periods were still a recurring reality, they weren't always monthly for everyone, which didn't make them pleasant, just slightly less frequent. Now let's gently float toward the early modern period. Renaissance Europe, fancy collars, terrible medicine. Menstrual management remained mostly the same: cloth pads, belts, pins. But medical theories got more elaborate. Doctors wrote about balancing humors, about excess blood causing hysteria, about menstruation being necessary to prevent women from becoming dangerously emotional, which, again, feels like projection. There were also increasingly detailed rules about what menstruating women should not do: not bake bread, not touch wine, not garden, not have sex, not pray too enthusiastically. Basically, don't interact with anything important. Just sit quietly and wait it out, preferably without leaving evidence. One thing that's important to understand is that underwear as we know it was not universal. Many women didn't wear close-fitting undergarments until relatively late, so holding cloth in place required creativity. Garter-like belts, ties, layers of skirts, gravity doing most of the work. It was not sleek, it was not comfortable, but it functioned well enough to get through daily life. In some cultures outside Europe, there were different approaches. Indigenous communities around the world developed their own methods using natural materials: soft bark, dried grasses, sea sponges, animal fur, materials chosen based on availability and climate. Some cultures treated menstruation as a time of rest, others as a time of separation, some as sacred, some as inconvenient, all of them as normal. What's striking is how much effort went into silence, not comfort, not health, silence. Menstruation was something you handled without drawing attention. You learned from older women, you adapted, you reused what you had, and you moved on. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, we start seeing the beginnings of commercial products. Sort of. There were washable pads sold discreetly. Menstrual belts became more standardized, still reusable, still bulky, still something you had to wash yourself, often by hand, often in cold water, often without complaining. And throughout all of this, there was very little discussion of pain, discomfort, or emotional impact. Periods were expected to be endured, quietly, stoically, preferably without interfering with your duties, whether those duties involved farming, weaving, child-rearing, or attending court while pretending nothing was happening. So when we think about how people dealt with periods before modern products, the answer is not heroism or ignorance, it's adaptation, routine, and a lot of cloth. Folded, washed, reused, hidden away, passed down, rarely celebrated, rarely discussed. And honestly, the most exhausting part of it all might not have been the bleeding. It was the effort to pretend it wasn't happening. Let's slowly drift forward from here, because the industrial age is coming, and with it, the promise of convenience, and, as usual, a whole new set of problems. So let's ease ourselves forward into the late 19th century, where steam engines were loud, cities were crowded, and everyone suddenly pretended progress meant understanding the human body. It didn't. But it did change how periods were dealt with, mostly because capitalism eventually notices everything, even the things society would rather not talk about. By this point, reusable cloth pads were still the norm. They were folded rectangles of fabric, usually cotton or flannel, worn with menstrual belts. These belts were exactly as glamorous as they sound. Straps around the waist, more straps between the legs, buttons, hooks, adjustments, the kind of contraption that required planning, patience, and a strong willingness to pretend this was fine, which everyone did, because what choice was there? Washing these pads was its own quiet ritual: cold water first, because hot water sets stains, then soap, then scrubbing, then drying somewhere discreet, because the idea of anyone seeing them was somehow worse than the physical discomfort itself. Many women washed them at night, or early in the morning, or hid them behind other laundry. The work never stopped. Periods were not a break, they were just another task. Doctors of the era were still deeply confused. Some believed menstruation weakened women and required rest. Others believed activity was fine. Exercise was either dangerous or healthy, depending on who you asked and what year it was. Emotional changes were blamed on wandering wombs, weak nerves, or the general burden of being female. None of this resulted in better care, just more advice. Now here's where things start to shift slightly. Wars, specifically World War I. During the war, nurses needed absorbent materials to treat wounds. Cellulose bandages were developed, highly absorbent, disposable. And someone somewhere had a quiet realization. These could work for periods. That realization would eventually change everything, but not immediately. The first disposable menstrual pads appeared in the early 20th century. They were bulky, they were expensive, they were sold under euphemisms so vague you could buy them without ever saying what they were for. Ads talked about feminine hygiene and delicate needs. Never blood, never menstruation, just implication. Everyone understood. Nobody acknowledged it.
Tampons existed in primitive forms much earlier, but modern commercial tampons didn't become widely available until the 1930s, and even then they were controversial. Some people believed they were immoral. Others believed they were dangerous. Doctors worried about women touching their own bodies too much because apparently that was a greater concern than comfort or mobility. So, for decades, many women continued using reusable pads alongside early disposables, or switching back and forth depending on cost, availability, and personal comfort. And comfort was still not the priority. Discretion was. Being able to go to work, being able to move through public spaces without fear of staining, that mattered more than ease. One thing that's easy to forget is how revolutionary the idea of throwing something away actually was. Disposable products weren't just about convenience, they were about privacy. No washing, no drying, no evidence, which tells you everything about how menstruation was framed, something to be erased as quickly as possible. Throughout the 20th century, products improved, slightly thinner, slightly more absorbent, slightly less medieval. Advertising leaned heavily into shame reduction while still reinforcing it. You can feel confident, no one will know, stay fresh, as if the worst part of menstruation was the possibility of someone else finding out. And yet, despite all the technology, many things stayed the same. Pain was still underplayed, mood changes were still mocked, periods were still treated as something to work through without complaint. Just now you could do it in polyester instead of linen. If we zoom out and look at the full timeline, what stands out isn't how primitive the past was, it's how consistent the approach remained. Manage quietly, adapt with what you have, don't inconvenience anyone else. Whether it was moss, linen, wool, rags, belts, or disposable pads in a cardboard box hidden under the sink, the goal was always the same: function, silence, continuity. And there's something oddly calming about that consistency, not because it was good, it wasn't, but because it shows how humans, especially women, have always found ways to keep going, through discomfort, through misinformation, through social pressure. They folded cloth, they washed it, they pinned it in place, they went about their lives. Periods were never rare, they were never mysterious to the people experiencing them. They were only mysterious to the people writing history. And even then, not because they couldn't understand, but because they didn't feel like listening. So when we ask how people dealt with periods before modern products, the answer is long, quiet, and deeply human.
They dealt with them the same way people have dealt with everything else history throws at them, with improvisation, with resilience, and with very little applause. Now, as we come to the end of this slow drift through time, it's worth pausing for a moment, not to celebrate progress too loudly, that would ruin the mood, but to acknowledge how strange it is that something so universal was treated as invisible for so long, and how many generations managed anyway. So tonight, as you settle into bed, maybe let your thoughts wander back through those centuries, through candlelit rooms, through linen drawers, through quiet hands folding fabric, through lives lived fully, even while dealing with something no one wanted to talk about. History isn't always kings and battles. Sometimes it's just people figuring things out in silence. And on that note, it's time to rest. Thank you for listening. Slow your breathing. Let your thoughts drift. And when you're ready, good night.